Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fifth speaker in our series on race and transportation. I'm Evelyn Blumenberg. I'm a faculty member in urban planning and director of the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies in the Luskin School of Public Affairs at UCLA. Let me start by introducing our guest and turning things over to him. So I'm very excited this afternoon to have Walter Thompson-Hernández here today. Walter is an award-winning journalist, a writer, and a host. You may have seen his byline in the New York Times, where until last year, he covered global subcultures for the paper. He's been the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including one for his book, The Compton Cowboys, The New Generation of Cowboys in America's Urban Heartland, which was published last year. I'm going to be his PR agent. If you have not read that book, I'd strongly encourage you to get your hands on a copy. It's excellent. Recently, he also has received a lot of attention for his podcast, California Love. It's an audio memoir about coming of age in Los Angeles, and you can hear it on some of the usual outlets, Spotify, Apple, and Amazon. So I'm going to turn my camera off and turn things over to Walter to kick things off.
Thank you for having me. I wasn't sure if this was like a lecture. I think I was supposed to be in conversation with someone, but this is cool. Yeah, I appreciate the intro. I'm really excited to be here and to speak. I'm also kind of a product of UCLA. I was there for 1 year in the PhD program for Chicano Studies. My mom is still there as well. I'm super connected to UCLA in different ways. Yeah, like I said, I thought this was going to be like a more informal conversation between me and somebody else, but
we can do it that way.
Yeah, sure. I just don't like speaking at people. You know what I mean? Like lecturing at people. I'd rather just have a conversation about whatever it is you want to talk about.
And I know you passed on some images for us.
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
So I thought you were just going to talk us through the image, but let me just.
No. Yeah, definitely.
I'll just kick us off. So I'd mentioned your book. Maybe you can start by talking about why you wrote that book. What was the motivation behind that book? And then we'll take it from there.
Definitely, for sure. So I think the genesis of that book kind of starts with me as a 6-year-old, right? I grew up in Southeast LA, and my mom and I would always see Black folks on horses in Compton. And so for me, I think it was really interesting, the ways in which that was something I was seeing visually, but at school sort of wasn't learning about the ways in which that horses are used for transportation, but also sort of tap into this this extremely rich history of Black men and women, in equestrian culture and in horse culture, right? So I think the book sort of begins when I'm 6, so to speak, but then becomes a New York Times story, and that sort of leads to the book. And I think, yeah, it's both, I think, a way to really understand this really interesting, beautiful group of friends in Compton, who call themselves the Compton Cowboys, who are dedicated to both reinserting the Black cowboy and cowgirl back into the history books, but also, trying to normalize Black folks in cowboy culture. And I think if you ask them, it's one of their wishes and goals to sort of not make it this exceptional sort of story or experience whenever you see a Black person on a horse, right? And they use horses for different things. They use horses to literally get around Compton, but to also compete in rodeo events as well.
I was struck in reading the book that one of the mottos of the Compton Cowboys is "Streets raised us, horses saved us." So could you talk a little bit more? I mean, you started to introduce some of these themes, but talk a little bit more about the role of horses and the ranch itself and the activities around the ranch in saving the lives of both the youth, so sort of the youth participation, as well as the return and the sort of adult participation in the ranch.
Definitely. Well, I think, the Compton Cowboys story really begins with the horses. It really begins in this 5-acre horse ranch in the heart of Compton, which I think to a lot of people, particularly who don't live in Compton, if you bring up horse or ranch and Compton together, it kind of sounds like oxymoronic. It's like not every day that you see those words together. But I think, the horses are, like I said, in fact, a mode of transportation, but they're also more than that. They are a lifestyle, and they're also, I think, a form of therapy. Like the ranch to me is actually a therapeutic center. It's somewhere where people go on a daily basis to both heal from PTSD, from different forms of trauma. Equine therapy is a real thing. It's used in so many different parts of the world for different reasons. And I think like what the Compton Cowboys have done is really tapped into a form of equine therapy that they live and die by. It's something that, if you, not to sensationalize this, but if you ask every one of the Compton Cowboys, like how important horses are in their lives, it's something that they speak the world of. Like many will tell you, if it wasn't for these horses, I don't know if I'd be here. And really what that means is that, something happens whenever someone hops on their horse, right? When someone hops in the saddle and rides their horse around Compton, they are physically treated and seen differently than if they were in a car or on foot or on a bicycle, right? So, it sort of makes us think about like the politics of transportation and of movement and mobility, right? Because these horses are, something that's used to get from point A to point B, but there's sort of like a different experience. Police don't mess with them, police don't stop them, they aren't harassed. It's almost like this 8-foot, 600-pound form of armor that they put on when they ride their horses. And that's something that, in writing this book, I spent about 1.5 years with them. It was a deep ethnography. I was at the ranch every single day for an entire year. Sometimes I get there like 4 a.m. and I wouldn't leave until 12 o'clock at night. And that's what I experienced. Like I would see the differences, them driving somewhere, them walking somewhere, and them on their horse. And I think what they've done is really sort of brought horse awareness and horse culture back into a really popular national conversation.
One of the comments I was going to make is linking. So we have, I think, at least some of our audience is I gave Walter a heads up that some of the audience is a transportation sort of audience. And so, your book is peppered with references to all kinds of issues of transportation, sort of the role of the horse, but also sort of aspects of using the horse where other transportation options are not, available. The one other thought I had, and I'm just curious about your response. So the transportation scholars typically talk about travel. Here's the economists: travel is a derived demand, that most people consume travel not because of its direct benefits, because it allows them access to opportunities, right? Access to jobs and services and whatnot. And I think one of the lessons that I learned from reading your book is that, you kind of underscore both its purposes, both the direct and the indirect benefits of sort of transportation. In this case, we're talking about the role of horses, which is why, I kind of asked you this question about kind of the role of horses in saving the lives of those who worked with them, right? As well as the role of horses in accessing and getting around the neighborhood as well, potentially in a way that is safer than other kinds of modes, right? Yeah. So can you talk about that a little bit more? And especially you do talk a lot about issues of safety, which we have talked about, both on the police side as well as on the gang side. And those are themes in your book as well.
Totally. Yeah. Well, just hearing you say that, like, immediately makes me think about, a lot of the sort of advocacy work around bike lanes throughout Los Angeles, right? And sort of like the very real disparities around like what types of neighborhoods in LA have access to bike lanes. You know, I'm from Southeast LA. There's no bike lanes here, right? So if you ride a bike, that's sort of like at your own discretion, you know, like good luck sort of thing, right? And I think about Compton, you know, it's not necessarily bike lanes that folks like the Compton Cowboys are fighting for. It's actual horse lanes, right? Like they are at city council meetings advocating for horse riding lanes throughout Compton because a few years ago, I think there were about 10 or 12 horse deaths, right? Like horses died as a result of cars hitting them in and around Compton. So like the issue of access, the issue of transportation, and the issue of, you know, these horses are yes, they're animals, but they are someone's transportation, right? And I think like in terms of safety and of saving lives, it's like, yes, you know, these horses have had an incredible impact on each one of the Compton Cowboys, but you know, at the same time, the Compton Cowboys are also trying to save more horses' lives, right? By like going to city council meetings and, you know, showing up to the meeting, which I went to a few times with them in research for this book. And, you know, hearing them say how important it is to have horse lanes, like how they need horse riding trails around the canals. And there's like a lack of that. So when you said that, it made me think about, you know, just like how many friends of mine actually who are urban planners, who do focus on transportation, who are doing that in the bike sort of lane context, but like they're doing that also in Compton with regards to horses.
Yeah, great. In what ways do you think that the Compton Cowboys have eradicated some of the stigma associated with the city of Compton? I want to talk about Compton also. Right. And I know that Compton is a city that is changing, and you know, you kind of talk about that change. But you know, so first, kind of the link between the Compton Cowboys and stigma around Compton, and then some of your thoughts about sort of moving forward and changes in the city of Compton as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, every member of the Compton Cowboys was born either mid 80s, early 80s, or late 80s, right? So we're talking about like a specific era when a lot of these folks were raised. And, you know, if you're from LA, if you're from South Central or Southeast LA, you understand that time period in this sort of regions, like history was tumultuous, you know, and you know, and I'm not exaggerating, like, you know, crack cocaine epidemic, the increase of policing in these communities and neighborhoods, there was a lot going on, right? So I think, you know, a lot of these folks were raised in this sort of NWA, gangs, crack cocaine era. And so Maisha Akbar, who started the original sort of like Compton Cowboys, you know, horse riding group in 1988, she sort of had to compete, you know, with gangs to essentially create a horse riding club, right? But I think what they're doing today is like, you know, they understand that sort of Compton has, you know, this sort of stigma associated with it. You know, I think when anybody around the world thinks about Compton, they probably think about like Dr. Dre or NWA or Kendrick Lamar or violence or police corruption, whatever it is. But I think the Compton Cowboys sort of like want to insert conversations around horse riding, around giving back, and really sort of like, I think, trying to understand that like that the Black experience is also not monolithic, right? Like they're trying to both say that yes, like, you know, Black folks can also ride cowboys, and also Black folks have been integral to the cowboy experience at the beginning of like Western expansion, right? So that's what they're trying to do, and I think, you know, what they're doing has been really interesting, right? Because, you know, this is all happening as social media has kind of taken off. I think like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, like all these different sort of social media channels allow for people to become aware of what you're doing, right? So, you know, in writing this book, I spent time in Houston with like Black cowboy cultures there, in Atlanta, and also New York. And I think what I found is that like they're all staying connected, right, through social media, and the Compton Cowboys have sort of become, you know, the leaders of this like resurgence of the Black cowboy. And I think they're doing that, you know, by posting videos of them riding around Compton. And like, that's sort of inspiring other Black groups like in Atlanta or like Houston to also do that too. So there's this sort of like formative Black cowboy, like national movement happening. And a lot of it has to do with like social media.
Yeah, I was going to ask you because I thought that the question at the end of the book, when sort of Randy Hook, one of the Compton Cowboys, asked Charles Sampson, one of the great Black bull riders from Watts, so from here in LA, asked this question: what are you most excited about with the state of Black cowboy culture? Which I thought I would pose that question to you. So at this moment in time, you know, sort of what excites you about that generally? And then I'm curious about what you think that means, again, sort of bringing it back to Compton, sort of moving forward in terms of the city of Compton as well.
Yeah, right, definitely. I'll answer part 2 first, right? Because I was supposed to answer that last time. But I think, you know, in terms of moving forward, I think what the Compton Cowboys have really tapped into, you know, like last summer, they led this really huge ride for like racial justice in Compton, which I was there to also cover and actually wrote a story about that. But, you know, that to me was sort of like at the height of, you know, a lot of the movements, you know, the national and international movements around like Black racial justice and sort of advocating for that. They were right at the heart of that, you know, so I think like, you know, we've seen demonstrations and actions for racial justice before, right? Like that's been documented, but we've never seen a sort of movement being led by Black cowboys and Black cowgirls. So to me, that was really interesting. And it also made me think about like, you know, that was a sort of international moment, right? Where it's like everyone covered that. Like I covered that at the New York Times, like CNN covered that, BBC, Al Jazeera. Everyone sort of has that image of Compton, right? Where it's like Compton, California, Compton Cowboys leading a peace ride for racial justice. And like, that wasn't a sort of image that existed 10 or 15, 20 years ago. So I think in terms of moving forward, you know, the Compton Cowboys are incredibly involved in the community. They are involved with the Mayor Brown, and they've been sort of working to really change the narrative. You know, I think like there's something redemptive about these horses. And there's also something, the other side of that is that like, you know, ultimately like riding a horse to Compton, it might be safer, but it also won't save your life at the end of the day. So I think we're still working to sort of advocate for, you know, peace in the community and for more resources, right? And in terms of like what's most exciting now, I think, like to answer that question about Charles Sampson, you know, and I was there for that moment when at the PBR rodeo circuit in downtown LA. I think what's most interesting and exciting is sort of like, I mean, I can't help but to talk about like Lil Nas X, right? And you know, the rapper musician, country musician star who sort of like Old Town Road becomes this crazy song, this crazy thing that sort of happens like a few months after the Compton Cowboys sort of make their splash on popular culture. And I think it's interesting, you know, I think, you know, we're seeing it more in popular media and popular culture where like commercials or like brands like are sort of having like more images of Black men and women riding horses. So in terms of what's most exciting, I think normalizing the Black cowboy and Black cowgirl experience to me is most exciting because that's what they want. You know, like they don't want people to see them on screen and to be like, wow, you know, Black people ride horses. They want they want people to see them on screen and to think, yeah, of course, you know, like there are Black folks who also ride horses as well. So I think that's what's most exciting, I think.
Great. So I don't want to push you here, but I know you had some images. I'm not sure who in the audience has read the book. Do you want to share some of those images so that people have a sense of what it is that you're, and I'm not even sure, I haven't looked at those images, but.
Yeah. I don't have them, but I sent them. So I think someone on staff maybe has those, I think.
Can we share a few of those images and maybe you could just talk through,
Yeah,
I don't know if we want to do all of them. You can let us know when we're ready to pause here.
Cool.
Great.
That sounds
And it
good.
might just give people, so now that we've kind of introduced some of these themes, it might, sort of, we can attach some images to them as well. Thank you to the help. So here we go. Walter, do you want to talk just a little bit? You can let us know, you don't have to go through all of them, and you can tell us when to skip through them. But if you could just kind of highlight some descriptions so that everybody gets a flavor of some of the individuals that were involved, I think would be great to personalize it.
Great. So I'll talk about this photo here. The last photo was Randy Hook, and he was sort of like fixing his hat. And that was actually the morning before the PBR event in downtown LA. Actually, the quote that you referred to about Charles Sampson, that happened morning, and this was like a really sort of like profound morning, because like Randy was like getting on, he's like the leader of this group, and so he's like getting like texting everybody, calling people, trying to get everyone organized, to show up on time to this event. And he goes back in his room and he starts like putting on his hat, and I follow him, and he just starts like breaking down into tears. He just starts sobbing, and he starts crying, and he sort of like has this really personal, intimate moment with me that he can't really show in front of others, right? And he's breaking down and he's crying, and he's speaking about the pressure, right? Like the pressure of being the leader of this group, and how many people, how so many people rely on him, both financially, but also for like leadership and for resources. And sort of like, so I just felt like that moment was so powerful and special, because it was just like a moment that not a lot of people got to see, and I was there for that. This is Carlton Hook. Carlton is actually Randy's twin brother, and I took this photo, I think like early summer of 2018, and like this is like a normal photo. Like Carlton walks around the ranch just like this, bareback if it's hot, and he rides horses like this. He feeds the horses. He tends to their stalls, and I thought this was a really cool photo because this is Carlton, yeah, it's Carlton Hook. This is a really cool photo. This is actually, I took this photo when I was working on the original New York Times story. I think it was like February of 2018. And I mean, I just think like, this is a really iconic photo, because like, I'm just following them, as they're going to go buy some food. And, they don't have saddles on their horses. Kenneth has just ordered food. He parked his horse. He tied his horse to the pole, and he went and ordered food. And then he got back in his horse to wait for the food. And I actually write about this scene in the book. This is like the moment that one of the horses sort of gets spooked. There's a really loud car honk, and the horse just sort of takes off, and it runs away, and almost gets hit by a car and almost dies, frankly. And I just thought this was a really cool photo, because it was really early on, like a week after I first met them, and I think about this photo often. This is Anthony, and it's in the Imperial Courts housing projects in Watts. This is where Anthony lives, and it was, I think, early afternoon. He had just come back home from his shift at the ranch. He works as a sort of like, it's the main person, he does everything at the ranch. And so he just gets home and he's about to take off his hat, and I'm there for that moment. This is Anthony and his son, little Anthony. And it's sort of, I think, like a really sort of profound moment, because he's like fixing his son's hat, and they're about to go ride around and I think buy some food. And I thought it was really special. It sort of shows this generational component, right? Where like, cowboy culture is something that is like so deeply rooted in this like passing of it, and learning. And Anthony's a great example. He's such an incredible father, and you know, one thing that he loves to do is teach his son about cowboy culture. It's a really cool photo too. This is just in early evening. The sun's about to set in Compton. This is like right in front of their ranch, and I took this photo, and it's just like a very simple portrait of someone who's on their horse, you know, who's taking their horse out for an evening ride, and you know, every member of the Compton Cowboys like loves their horses so much, and I just felt that, and I felt the pride in this photo. This is like just a photo of someone washing dishes, essentially. You know, I think we all have chores in our home, and I just thought it was really cool because it sort of like taps into quotidian life. You know, like this is a photo. This could be anybody, especially during this pandemic. I feel like we're all washing so many more dishes than usual, right? And I just felt like it was really cool. This is a photo of a funeral, actually. One of the Compton Cowboys, he was living in New York at the time, and he actually passed away in a motorcycle accident. His name was Slim, Cowboy Slim. And this is sort of like at his funeral, a few hours after the funeral, there was like a barbecue, you know, in memory of his life. And everyone sort of like put blue balloons up in the air to honor him. This is that same funeral. This is CJ, a similar photo as one of the ones we just saw. You know, a lot of pride in this photo. CJ works the night shift in at Walmart, and sort of this was really early in the morning. I think he had just left his night shift and had got to the ranch around in the morning to ride his horse, and this is what he's doing. These are Anthony's granddaughters, and like I said with like Anthony's son, right? Like a big aspect of cowboy culture is, you know, this idea that you are supposed to pass it down to the next generation, and the smile on their faces are really adorable, and I thought it was a really special moment. This is Anthony. Every Friday he rides his horse to his granddaughter's elementary school in Watts, and you know, the kids just lose it, like they go berserk. And I was there for a couple of Fridays, and the kids are just going crazy, like when they see this horse on their schoolyard, and they sort of expect it to come every Friday. This is Anthony and his grandkids in the Imperial Courts. This is Kiera, the only woman in the group, and she's, you know, a really incredible person. That's her daughter, and this is in South Compton, and she was just hanging out at her grandma's house, and they invited me over. They had like a big Sunday meal, and she went for a walk, and I took this photo. Just a regular Tuesday or Wednesday at the ranch, you know. Yeah, this is during the Compton Christmas Parade, which is a really big deal for the Compton Cowboys. This is their second year riding as a group. You know, before that they hadn't rode in the parade for almost 15 years, and it was sort of a resurgence, you know, of old friends riding horses again. This is a photo that they are just about to head out to the Compton Christmas Parade, and I was able to take this photo. Cool.
Great. Those are great. You took all those pictures?
I did, yeah.
They're beautiful. I mean, one question, and you wrote about this a little bit somewhere. There's such intimate portraits of individuals. I mean, you could kind of see it in the photographs that you just shared. Can you talk? You're an ethnographer, you know, and the book very much has, you know, that is central, is sort of your approach. Can you talk a little bit about that and your method in doing this work?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. I think like for me, like I think before working for the New York Times, I think like it was my idea that I was going to be an academic, and it was my, who was also going to be a journalist, and sort of balance both. And I think, so my training sort of, starts and begins with ethnography, right? In the ways that anthropologists and sociologists are trained in ethnography, full immersion, where I am both at times a participant and an observer, right? I think that's like a really sort of special thing, particularly if you're a person of color in communities of color. But for me, like that's my practice, right? Is a lot of the training that I received, was from sociologists and anthropologists, right? And I think the difference though is that I think, the academy, also has like a dark past and a really dark history, right? In terms of like ethnography and anthropology, and sort of like how it was created to essentially like study and extract, I think, really important information and knowledge from communities of color around the world. And I think like that's the genesis of a lot of these methods, right? And I think for me, it's like, as a person of color, as a person who identifies racially with a lot of the people who I spend time with, my experience is going to be different, right? I think, I am of course going to be a participant because I identify with everyone who I spend time with, but I'm also an observer. And I think like the idea, I don't really believe in objectivity. I think like our personal biases and our personal experiences are so deeply rooted and embedded into whatever we do. So I want to be honest about that, like it's impossible for me as a person of color to just be a fly on the wall, right? Like I'm gonna be a participant. It's almost like who I am. And so that's been my practice, right? Is like ethnography, but just like, I'm not parachuting into a community, and I'm not extracting information. I'm actually working with people to help tell a story, in ways that I think like I went to Stanford for a grad school and UCLA as well. And I think how I was taught was that like, I'm the expert. I think like, that's like week one of qualitative methods, right? Week one of like any methods class is that you are the expert, know more than the community that you're entering. And I think I don't agree with that at all, right? Like, I think the first thing I tell people, whether I'm working on a story here in South Central or in Madagascar or in Japan or Brazil, is that like, I'm actually not the expert here. I'm just here to listen and to learn, and that you are the expert, and like, there's no way that I know more about someone's life than they do. Like they are the experts of their own story. And so that's kind of like been my approach, right? Is that like, I've been really fortunate to have a platform over the past few years, and I just like, help tell really interesting and beautiful stories.
I'm curious, so do you ride? Were you riding the horses as well? Did you learn how to ride?
No. I never rode a horse in Compton since meeting them, because if I'm being honest with you, it's like what if something happens? What if I like break a leg or arm? Like that's just not cute. That's not a good. So nah, I never rode a horse in Compton.
Just curious. Yeah. One of the comments that you made when you were, showing the photographs was about sort of Randy and how much pressure he was under. You write about it in the book as well, because one of the themes in the book was also one. I mean, we kind of talked about change in Compton, but there was also, sort of a theme about organizational change as well. And so I was curious what you learned about, about that. There was a change in leadership. There was, all of that. So, can you share your thoughts about sort of organizational change, how to manage it? What are the seeds for success? Those sorts of things.
Yeah, totally. So what happened with the Compton Cowboys is that, they were initially the Compton Junior Equestrians, right? And sort of like led by Maisha Akbar. So when Randy sort of takes over, he starts a new sort of chapter of that called the Compton Cowboys. The difference is this, right? Is that, with the Compton Junior Posse earlier in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, is that they had financial support, right? Like they had really white, wealthy donors who would donate a lot of money to like Black children riding horses. Like it was a really sort of like great great idea. You know, I think so that's kind of what happened with that. When Randy takes over, you know, Maisha retires, and a lot of the really wealthy and prominent board members retire as well. But I think some of that was also rooted in like this idea that you can you can support and resource Black children, but like grown Black men and women, sort of like there's a different stigma associated with that, right? So, you know, that's sort of organizationally what was happening. So Randy sort of has to start from square one. You know, he has to find a new board. He has to find resources to fund a very expensive ranch, which costs almost $15,000 a month to finance. You know, the horses, the horse feed, the water, everything. Right, it's really expensive. So Randy sort of like has to do all this on his own. And I think what's different about Randy is that, you know, his aunt Maisha, you know, used to go knocking on doors for resources and for membership, and she used to apply to grants and do all these things that are necessary, right? And Randy was like, no, you know what? Let's use, you know, this wave of energy that we have and sort of use like modeling and entertainment and all these different things to like fund our ranch. And I think that's what Randy has been doing. You know, like a lot of people now are donating because of the sort of like media sort of like splash that they've made. And I think that's been their like model recently. So now most of the board are members of the Compton Cowboys. Like it's no longer these like really wealthy white folks. It's people from Compton. And I think there's something really powerful and special about that.
And have you seen the changes in Randy as well?
Yeah, no, like Randy's a really intelligent guy. He's so bright. And I think he understands like you can't treat everyone the same. We all have different personalities. And I think like for him, you know, he's kind of an introvert. He's always working. And I think he sometimes feels kind of unappreciated. You know, I think like one of the things that I really realized when spending time with him was that, you know, sometimes like he needs and wants people to tell him thank you for his work, because they don't see the behind the scenes work that he does. You know, they only see, you know, when like the cameras show up, or when like Tommy Hilfiger shows up, or when Adidas shows up, and that's kind of all they see. But Randy's a great guy.
You showed that photograph of the Christmas parade, and you know, sort of talked about how important that was. And I loved the picture in front of the restaurant as well, with the horses, right? You know, so you know, it's sort of that cowboy presence is very, you know, is visible in Compton. So we've talked a little bit about the importance to, you know, to those that were, you know, sort of involved. Can you talk from, you know, the community side of things when they're seeing the horses and the cowboys as part of parades on the streets? Yeah. What difference do you think that makes?
Yeah.
And including to you talk about your own experience in seeing them as well, right?
Yeah, no.
I'm glad that wasn't me.
Another friend of mine just called me, actually. Sorry about that. But no, I think it's like, you know, it's interesting. I think for me, like, I remember the like very sort of like, you know, the visceral reaction that I had seeing Black men on horses for the very first time. And I think about like the power of that feeling for others as well. You know, I think, you know, it's especially interesting that I think like, you know, a lot of the folks who are born and raised in Compton, like this isn't part of their curriculum. You know, like this like vast history of like Black men and women on horses throughout time. You know, they're only learning about like the John Waynes and the Marlboro sort of cigarette admins and like, you know, like really white cowboys essentially. So I think like it's such an important moment for like a lot of these like, you know, young people in Compton to see what the Compton Cowboys do, because it just provides them with like an alternative and like, you know, another way to be a resident of Compton. You know, it's like not subscribing to like the stereotypes or stigma. You know, I think it just really helps folks see themselves in another way. And I think that's something that, you know, young people are such a big part of what the Compton Cowboys are interested in. You know, they have a thriving youth program that has been paused because of the pandemic, right? But I think that's all they really care about, right? Is to provide an environment where like young people, you know, are interested in horse riding. They're trying to make horse riding cool again. And, you know, they just want to ensure that they aren't the last Black cowboys in Compton.
It seems to me that one of the themes in the book, but also your podcast, is around themes of belonging. And that, you know, you can kind of trace that through the various sort of characters. Can you just talk about that in general, you know, sort of the importance of belonging? What difference does it make? You know, because that is such a major theme.
Yeah, like there's so much to say about that. You know, I think like for me, every story that I've ever worked on, you know, in any part of the world or in any part of LA, kind of always like ask questions about belonging and about meaning, right? And I think for me, it's always like, you know, what like, how do we see ourselves? You know, what forces in the world are telling us that we belong, and what forces in the world are telling us that we don't belong? And I think like that's at the core of this Compton Cowboys book, at the core of everything that I do. And I think, you know, it's a sort of existential question, right? I think so many people ask that question, like, who am I? Who's in my tribe? And, you know, who or what do I belong to? And I think like what was most interesting about the Compton Cowboys book was, you know, not the fact that like, I think folks of color responded well to that book, but like that, like random white people from like Iowa or like Canada or like Denmark were like sending me emails talking about like how interesting, how cool, how beautiful the Compton Cowboys what experience to them was. And I thought that was interesting because like I said, like, you know, like I obviously, you know, work on stories about people of color who I absolutely love and respect and think the world of. But I also think that's interesting when white folks also respond to these to these stories in like a really prominent way, because like it just sort of gets me thinking about like, I think so many of us as like storytellers or whatever it is, we were sort of brought up and raised to believe that like whenever we create something, that we're supposed to be thinking about a very broad, diverse audience, right? And I think what I found is that when we get sort of hyper specific about our audience, like that's when stories become universal and not the other way around, right? So it's like, I really wanted like to not explain this world to people, to not over explain, but to really present it as it was. Cause like everyone has access to Google, you know, if you don't understand a word or a phrase, you can Google something. And I think like, that's kind of what I've been doing for a while now.
What do you think it was around the horses and the ranch that created that sense of belonging? Because you write about that as well in great detail. You know?
Yeah. No, totally. Like, I think what was different about this book project was that, you know, the ranch is essentially the central character. You know, this is a book about place. It's about geography, right? It's like less about interpersonal relationships than it is about a place and like what home can be for us, and like how home looks different for each one of us, right? Like sometimes it is a sentiment, sometimes it is a sound, sometimes it is a taste, sometimes it's a person, and sometimes it's a horse ranch in the heart of Compton. And I think like that's what's so interesting about this, is that the ranch is literally an ecosystem that has so many different sort of like arteries that extend all over Compton, and everyone always finds their way back. And so, you know, in terms of what home is, like a lot of folks, you know, come from environments that their homes weren't the most positive experiences for them, but the ranch was always there, and the horses were always there. And I think, you know, as adults, the Compton Cowboys still really gravitate towards it because of that.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about your podcast and your motivation for doing the podcast? I think that everyone would be interested in that as well.
Totally. I think the motivation, like I had never really worked in sound before or in radio, so to speak. And I actually like left the New York Times to come back home and work on the show. And I think for me, it's like I have ADD, so I get bored of things really often, right? So I have to kind of keep it fresh all the time. So I might be doing something different in like 3 or 5 years. But California Love for me was really an audio memoir, right? About, coming of age in Los Angeles, both in Southeast LA, but also on the West Side, like in Venice and other places, at a time that I think was like really special and unique. And I think, living in New York for 3 to 4 years and coming back home, like I saw a lot of different changes. A lot of the places that I experienced weren't there. A lot of my friends had been priced out of their homes and their families' homes and have moved up to like Scottsdale, Arizona, or like San Bernardino or Ontario, different places. And I think California Love was really sort of like, I don't want to say a love letter because that sounds kind of cheesy, and people use that all the time. It's like, oh, it's a love letter to LA, maybe, right? But it's more so, I think, just like, just an audio recording that I hope will exist for a really long time to capture a certain moment in time, right? And I made that show for like my friends and my family who grew up like me and who continue to sort of have this nostalgia for something that we will never be able to see or feel again. And that's what California Love is. It's a testament to that, to people who are still in LA, who have chosen to fight gentrification, for people who have been forced to leave. And that's what it's about.
Great. That's great. Why don't we, I think we have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
If there's anything else you want to say, why don't we, Juan, looks like we have the start of a question. I can kick back in and ask other questions, but why don't we open it up to our audience?
All right, I will bring on the first questioner. Maddie, just for expediency, I'll promote you to ask your question.
Great. Thank you. This was a really informative talk, and I think has really kind of capped, we've been talking really data heavy but kind of in stories and legal and all these other things. And it's always refreshing to kind of like pull back and hear on this. Yeah. So I had to pull up my question see if I remember it. So I'm a transportation researcher that works on, among other things, transportation safety issues. And that's actually what I was trying to do as I was like moving tables around, but I've just been so engaged in what you're saying that I'm going to come back to that later. But I was really struck by the point that you made about how there's been a number of horses that have died. And in work that I'm doing, I think a lot of people are doing is, how kind of traffic violence really affects people's lives to a much greater degree when you're not sitting on a giant horse. So I'm curious if kind of like in doing this ethnography, if like those types of issues kind of, just around like individual safety, but then I'm also kind of thinking, curious about if you heard people, how they kind of weigh different, there's unfortunately so many hazards. And I think that you've touched on a lot of them. And so I'm curious, like, if you've heard, like, is traffic, it's like kind of fear of cars, how high, is it a really big concern, or are there like other larger things? Kind of like, where did you hear about this as a priority?
Right. I think it's a priority for horse riders who live within the Richland Farms, which is like the Richland Farms are the sort of agriculture area in Compton, and the Richland Farms are where everyone sort of owns horses, right? So if you live within the Richland Farms, like it's interesting, like the Richland Farms, there are no sidewalks, like it's just sort of like street, and it was intended for people to ride horses. But I think once you leave the Richland Farms, it's sort of, it doesn't become this oasis anymore. It sort of becomes like, these like very long, wide streets where full of cars that travel at very high speeds. And so the risk factor was something that people spoke about often. And it's like, well, some people drive, some people walk, and some people take their horses wherever they need to go. And so if you're a horse rider, I think the threat is something that is tangible, and it's not just sort of like abstraction. It actually becomes a real thing, which has led them to advocating for that in city council meetings, right? So I think like hearing that and spending a year and a half with them really helped me understand, like, you know, transportation and sort of like traffic violence means something, probably means different things in different parts of the city, right? Like if we're talking about Koreatown, for example, or like the West Side, or like the Valley, or the East Side, you know, that conversation probably doesn't involve horses. You know, it probably involves like sidewalks or like bicycle lanes. But in Compton, you know, it's a real conversation that a lot of people are trying to have.
How did most people walk? I mean, how do people get to the ranch? I'm gonna take my down.
Yeah, they either walk. You know, a few of the Cowboys live in different streets. They like hop over people's houses to get to the ranch. Some people drive, and some people get rides, and some people ride their bikes.
Well, great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, our next question is from Charlotte, which is related to the previous question. And Charlotte, perhaps you can come on camera and expand upon your question. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Walter, for being here. This has been really fantastic. I especially loved what you were talking about ethnography and not being the expert, right? And learning. Everyone's the expert of their own experience. And although I'm not a transportation planner, I'm going to ask a sort of transportation planner question. I think this really builds on what Maddie was just asking is, you know, what can transportation planners learn about safety from the Compton Cowboys and how they, you know, they feel safe on their horses as they move through the city? What can transportation planners learn? Learn about that from that experience.
Totally. I think it sort of starts with like listening and thinking about nuance and thinking about like regional context, right? I think, like I just said earlier, you know, it's like it almost seems like, you know, this like wholesale approach to like transportation safety. And again, I'm not an urban planner. I'm not a transportation like scholar by any means, but I do know how it works like in the sort of day-to-day context, right? But I think this sort of wholesale approach to like safety, you know, maybe ignores like hyper regional sort of needs, right? And the needs for like certain communities who need different things. Like I said, I think like, you know, not every community in LA needs a horse lane. You know, like why would you have a horse lane in Koreatown, right? Like you know, it just doesn't make sense. And I used to live in Cape Town, so that's why I say that. But I think just like listening to a community's needs and trying to understand what they need is sort of how you start the conversation. And I think like that's maybe the only way to go.
Thank you.
All right, we have a question from Professor Abel Valenzuela, who had to leave for another Zoom, but he's asking about—
He's a friend of mine, yeah.
All right. He says, congratulations, great book, great work, great analysis. I was wondering if you could talk about similar horse transportation in other parts of LA, like Whittier Narrows, Pico Rivera, or other places, and that there are different demographics in those local communities, perhaps more Latinos in those neighborhoods, and any comparisons that you have he's interested in.
Cool. Yeah. You know, I didn't spend a lot of time in Whittier or the East Side per se, but I think like in terms of demographics, right? Like Compton is absolutely has been experienced like demographic shifts. I think over the past 10 or 15 years, it's almost like Latino, Latinx majority now. And I think like, you know, these are folks who moved to the rich and farmed, which again is, you know, a sort of like horse riding section of Compton. But these are folks who are first, second generation, you know, migrants from Mexico often. And so they're bringing their ideas of equestrian culture and horse riding culture to these spaces, right? But I think in terms of comparison, it's a lot of the same sort of issues, right? Where it's like, in a lot of these places, right? In like Whittier, for example, like there like are allocated horse riding sections of that city near the canal where like folks can ride horses. And I think that's kind of what the Compton Cowboys don't have. That's what they've been advocating for.
And then Professor Valenzuela is also wondering any comparisons you could draw with the higher end, more exclusive horse communities in Los Angeles County, like Rolling Hills, I believe is one, West Hills, other places.
Yeah, I think, there are disparities, right? I think a lot of those places like Rolling Hills or Palos Verdes, right? Like these are established equestrian sort of places where like folks can go and it's designated. And I think like local city governments have more resources allocated because it's a much more prominent area. And I think like the fact that, Compton continues to be an under-resourced city kind of speaks volumes to that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Laura, I was looking to bring you on to ask a question. If you are willing, just please respond to your chat. I will ask another question that's been posed earlier in the talk. And I'm not sure it's the focus of any of your studies, but are there models perhaps that the Compton Cowboys are aware of urban planning around horse lanes and other cities, like where it might work? I mean, granted, there are the more exclusionary communities that plan for horses from the ground up, but maybe retrofitting in other places. Is there a model that perhaps they look towards?
I think like in terms of a model, I think what has been going on in Philadelphia with the Fletcher Cowboy community out there is it's almost like the same experience as Compton, right? Where it's like there is a horse ranch, a prominent horse ranch in Philadelphia, and sort of like it becomes this place where like folks go to ride and to experience horse culture, and they're sort of advocating for the same things there. I think some of the same challenges arise where, there are a lack of horse lanes for these horses, and we're also seeing that in Compton as well.
Okay, thank you. Laura, did you want to ask your question?
Sure, yeah, gracias, Walter. So appreciate this conversation. And my question, so I live in Southeast Los Angeles, by the river. And so just thinking about all of the money that's coming down because of the Lower LA River plan, and everybody's got, hopefully, theoretically, the best intentions,
Right.
but it's significantly causing a lot of displacements with COVID, before COVID. And there's a lot of significant investment going into the Compton, Linwood, Southgate area. And I'm just wondering if the Compton Cowboys have thought about that. Is this impacting them? I imagine it is. I imagine they're also low income communities. And so just wondering any thoughts around that.
Yeah. I do know that the Cowboys often ride their horses to, like, I think it's like South Compton, North Long Beach, like there, like along the LA River, like there are these like horse stables, and they often ride their horses there. I don't know if they're aware of the recent developments in funding for these communities. I couldn't even tell you.
Gracias.
Okay, I'm working on queuing up some other panelists.
Well, I can jump in let me jump in for a minute. And, it's interesting. A lot of people are asking you questions about like infrastructure, because that's kind of what planners, in part, what planners are interested in is trying to think about how to improve infrastructure. You talked about bike, you talked about, sort of infrastructure related to travel by horseback and all of that. But there are a lot of safety issues that you do talk about in your work, and so I wonder what some of just the broader lessons are from thinking about kind of the role of the Compton Cowboys and the role of horses as it relates to safety. And here I'm thinking about your discussions about the police in Compton and the role of the police in Compton, as well as the role of gangs in Compton as well. So if you could talk a little bit more about that, I think it would be really helpful.
Great. Just in terms of like of safety, broadly speaking.
Yeah, just thinking of broader notions of safety, not being,
Yeah. I think like in terms of broader notions of safety, I think, like it is a conversation. I think the narrative, right, that I think a lot of folks are really subscribing to in terms of safety is that like once these folks get on these horses, like everything changes, you know, and that they are sort of like, you know, on the backs of these animals, which like are a complete form of armor against everything, every single like source of danger that exists in and around the city of Compton. And I think, you know, that's not entirely accurate. I think these horses do change the perception of folks out in the community. You know, to be very blunt and very frank, like a Black man on a horse, you know, is alarming for some folks, and it sort of like raises like awe and questions, right? And I think like, you know, that's its own sort of discussion. But the reality is that, you know, accidents happen. Folks have been shot on horses. Folks have shot at people on horses. You know, police still stop people on horses. Like folks are still victims of hyper policing when they're on horses. And so I think like the narrative that all is well in Compton, and you know, the Compton Cowboys have really impacted their community in a really positive way. But I think in terms of like larger, maybe transportation safety issues, right? Or even safety more broadly, I think like, you know, it's a conversation that still needs to happen. You know, the fact that they're out riding their horses should not signify that, you know, real change has happened or real change has occurred. I think there's still a lot of work to be done.
Right. Juan, did we have another question queued up?
We do have a question from Paula. Paula, I've allowed you to unmute your microphone if you want to ask.
Hi, folks. I hope you can hear me. I am driving from the park with my dog. So thank you, Walter, for sharing everything that you did, specifically around your intentions of writing the book. I'm a community member here in Compton. And so I am curious to hear a little bit more about your analysis on this new funding model that you talked about, right? And the dangers that can arise from depending on corporations like Levi's and Adidas, ones that I see have profited from putting out racist information about Black folks and Indigenous folks. And so, yeah, I just want to hear more about your own thoughts and analysis around that. Gracias, thank you.
For sure, yeah. I have a lot to say about that. I think like it's a really sort of dangerous conundrum, right? Where it's like, you know, relying solely on these corporations and on these brands to fund this horse riding program, you know, like I wonder how sustainable that is, right? Like if I'm being really honest right now, and I wonder, you know, like if cowboy culture has in fact sort of like there has been a resurgence, so to speak, like how long will that last, right? And ultimately, like, you know, maybe this is like a bigger conversation about the role of capitalism and how it's incredibly unsustainable for anyone, and I think it really drives us to places that are unhealthy. But I think the Compton Cowboys, you know, are in a really sort of weird position often where they have to find money to fund this ranch, and without sustainable options, they often have to rely on like the modeling or like the brands or the corporations, you know, who are probably, you know, again, to be very transparent, who are probably funding the Compton Cowboys, you know, both as a tax write-off, but also because it's like, you know, Spirit Week for like diversity, right? So it's really complicated. And I think the Compton Cowboys, you know, people are paying attention to them now, but I'm curious like how long this will last.
So a number of times you've mentioned some of the pressures facing communities like Compton, but not only Compton. So you've touched on issues of gentrification. I mean, can you talk about that a little, you know, sort of a little bit more? Because I know that many in the audience will be interested in it, considering we're in the midst of just a terrible affordable housing sort of crisis that has really put pressure on communities and families, you know. Yeah. So can you talk about how that, you know, you feel like that's playing out?
Totally. Something that I saw that like connects the Compton Ranch to other Black horse ranches around the country, like whether it's Houston or Atlanta or Baltimore, is that like oftentimes like many of these ranches where they are geographically located are in these sort of like, you know, urban communities, right, so to speak, and, you know, who are often on the verge being gentrified as we speak, or, you know, in 5 to 10 years, like some of those early seeds that have been planted, right? So you start seeing more white folks who like go to Starbucks and like walk their dogs in these neighborhoods, like that's a sign, right? So I think in Compton, that's what folks have been seeing. Like there are more white people who are moving to Compton, and a lot of folks fear that, like, you know, property values have increased in the area, and, you know, taxes on the ranch have increased as well. So it's kind of a conversation around like the future of Black horse ranches in the US, you know, are predicated on, you know, gentrified communities, and can these horse ranches keep up with the rising costs of rent and of taxes? And I think, you know, it's never just been a conversation about horses or a horse ranch. It's also been a conversation about like structural issues, and gentrification is an incredibly important conversation to be having about that.
So I think you had mentioned this, I know it's in your book, about the connections between the ranch in Compton and efforts to connect sort of Black cowboy culture across the country. Do you see similar kinds of issues and pressures around the country, not just here in Compton?
Yeah, totally. Like I just said, I think in Philadelphia, the Fletcher Ranch there is on the verge of shutting down because folks just can't afford the rising cost of the ranch, of the horse ranch there. And I think, you know, it's a conversation about you know, like how involved or how much do people really care about these horse ranches? I think like people can like sensationalize the experience of Black cowboys, but at the end of the day, you know, what are you doing really to help keep these horse ranches alive? And, you know, it's like, you know, in so much of what Black cowboy culture is about, you know, promoting Black cowboy culture for the future. But if there's no horse ranch to sort of have, there won't be a future.
Great, thanks. I think we have another question from the audience.
Yes, we have a question from Nanette Rodriguez.
Hi, thank you again for sharing your story. It was really amazing, your work that you've done, Walter. I really appreciate it. I work at a public health nonprofit in San Gabriel Valley, and I currently do work in a Equestrian community in Los Angeles County called Bassett Avocado Heights that's predominantly Latinx. This community is next to freeways and industrial facilities, and like most communities of color, they've been neglected from receiving more amenities that allows active transportation, including safety for horse riding. My question is, what ways can we seek partnerships with other equestrian communities in Los Angeles County to share their stories and to support one another?
I think like, you know, reaching out, number one, but I also think that like, you know, it seems like there is a sort of like broad equestrian culture throughout like LA County and Los Angeles, but I think, you know, it still often feels like very fragmented, right? Like it seems like more could be done to, you know, connect a group like the Compton Cowboys to the group that you speak about, to a group in like Whittier, to a group in the Valley. You know, I think like so many of the challenges are more similar than they are different. And I think like it's just a matter of advocacy. I know everything starts locally, but, you know, is there a way to also make that a larger conversation?
Thank you so much. And I just want to show you too, I have a little horse here that I got from the community. And I got to ride out there too. It was scary the first time I rode a horse, but, you know, it's like you said, like, in order to really understand a community, in order to really, you know, be like, just understand who they are, you have to be there, you know, you have to talk to them, you have to listen to them. And I really appreciate what you had said earlier about that. Thank you again.
Thank you.
So not a horse question for a moment, you know, so in your work, you mentioned other kind of modes of transportation, and including I've heard sort of talking about your mother in your podcast as a kind of a transit sort of mentor. But I noticed even in the book you talked about sort of the selection of cars as a statement. I mean, there's not having access to a car because the license has been suspended and having to get around using Uber or ride hailing. So can you talk just a little bit about kind of your views about transportation and transportation access, in addition to the role of sort of horses as well?
Yeah, I think it's like, one thing that I realized in working on this book and writing this book was that I think like my idea about the role in transportation and like particularly urban spaces, right? It's like so much more complicated than like, a bus route or like a freeway or Uber or whatever it is. I think it's like the politics of who has access to what is something that I've always thought about, but especially thought about that, in writing this Compton Cowboys book. Like it just seems like, ultimately, there are different parts of LA which have easier access to rideshare programs, to like bike lanes, to ways in which to like get around Los Angeles and even LA, right? Thinking about its history, it's the sprawl, right? Really sometimes makes it challenging to really think about a sort of like system of transportation. But I think like in thinking about that, like for me, like it just shows also the sort of creativity of people of color and resilience. I think, the fact that like transportation access is disproportionately impacts Compton. So folks are like, all right, let's ride our horse, right? We're gonna find a way to get from point A to point B. And I think like we see that in communities of color throughout Los Angeles, right? Where like folks unfortunately have to find really creative and ingenious ways to whether it's carpooling or whether it's like taking different ways to get to work or to school. And I think the Compton Cowboys are a prime example of that.
So you may not know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask anyway, just in terms of, so you have this great podcast. I mean, so thoughts about your future work, I'm interested in that. Or if you're willing to share, you were traveling around the globe and you were pulled back to Los Angeles, maybe for California Love. I was kind of curious about how the podcast got its title, but sort of being, so two questions. So kind of what, why drawn back to Los Angeles and California, and what's next?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. I think to answer the first question, I think like my draw to come back to LA was that like I really missed home and I really missed LA, and I think I really missed like the community that I had here, and I miss like people in my family, like my mom, my aunt, people who raised me. And I felt like, I think there's something that happens with like, I think folks of color, particularly I'm an only child too, I think there's a certain guilt at times, like our success is often rooted in guilt. And us succeeding and going away and leaving home, there's like a subconscious guilt that is associated with that. And I started to feel that, and sort of question like me being away from home and me wanting to come back and help was something I really felt strongly. And so I did that. And I think what's next, I'm working on a lot of different projects right now. I'm no longer in journalism per se. It's more so like entertainment and TV and film. I'm like writing and hosting a show for like a show that I can't really speak about, but like I'm producing like a Netflix film. I'm writing my next book right now. It's a memoir for HarperCollins as well. And I'm directing 2 short films that are about to be adapted for features as well. So I'm doing a lot of different things. It's mostly like in the TV and film and audio space.
Right. And the guilt resonates with me for sure. About I'm from Los Angeles as well, have lived elsewhere and certainly pulled back. Van Nuys.
Oh, cool. Yeah. For sure.
So I think the last question will be from Claudia. Claudia?
Hi, Walter. I mainly just wanted to ask, and I think it goes really well with what you just said about having come back, but Since you came back to Lane, since you started researching your podcast, just in your mind, what would you say has changed the most, Venice or Southeast LA, since you were growing up?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm actually in Southeast LA right now. I'm at my aunt's house. I'm like taking this call from my aunt's house where I was born and raised. I'll have to
The
say
same place where you interviewed your mom?
Yeah. Like crazy. Like, that's where I'm at. But you know, I have to be honest. I have to say, Venice, like Southeast LA, like I'm starting to see, you know, sort of like hints of gentrification, particularly in like the local sort of Huntington Park city government, like their plans for quote unquote beautification. I think that's like a pathway to gentrification. But I think Venice, to me, like it's even hard going back sometimes. Like I can't even go back because it just feels so different. It's like a lot of white people around, like doing CrossFit, like, you know, sprinting around Venice blocks in like a really like absurd, crazy way. And you know, it's just so different. I think you know, Silicon Beach and Google and Snapchat really just disrupted the neighborhood in like a really sort of powerful way. And so Venice has changed so much. Like Venice, particularly Oakwood, the center of Venice used to be, you know, just a bunch of like Black and brown working class folks who were trying to get by, and some cool white people too, you know, like the artist types, you know, from the Beat Generation or whatever. But it's not that anymore, and I don't think Venice will ever be that anymore. And you know, it's still really hard to go back there sometimes because of that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I'm going to close things out, but any parting words, Walter, before we bring things to a close?
No, not really. Just thank you. You know, this has been really cool and really fun. I've never talked to like a group of like transportation folks, urban planner folks, so it was really cool to experience. I feel like I learned a lot, you know, in these conversations, and I really appreciate it.
Well, I can speak for myself. I certainly learned a lot and really enjoyed your book. So like I said before, if you've not read it, you can, you know, listen to the podcast, read the piece in the various papers, the New York Times, and you should definitely get the book. And I really want to thank you for taking time out of all of your activities to join us this afternoon. This was really terrific. We really appreciate it. And to sort of close out this sort of series, I want to thank all of the speakers and thank all of you for sort of joining us in this set of sort of speakers and panels over the last few weeks. All of the YouTube videos for the series will be available on the ITS YouTube channel. So if you'd like to see one that you haven't, you'd like to encourage your friends and family to take a look and a listen, sort of please do. So thanks again to Walter and all of you for joining us this afternoon.